Hello, students. This is the video lecture that I'm doing about newspapers for JMS 200. Corresponds with this textbook right here, The Mediated World by Mindich, the second edition. And without further ado, let's do this. And I am doing this outside, obviously, in my backyard. I can hear people doing yard work, but inshallah, with the microphone, the audio will come out well enough. That's what I'm hoping. The textbook begins by giving some examples of important stories that have been broken by newspaper reporters. And newspapers are still a very valuable, an extremely valuable place where original reporting is done, even if the print product itself might be disappearing. We're going to go way, way back to the beginning. And when we talk about the origins of newspapers, some people talk about these things that were sort of like printed slabs that were on public display in ancient Rome. Um, but when we talk about newspapers as a particular form of media, there are some characteristics. These are from the textbook. I'm looking at the textbook, looking down, page 81. Here are the characteristics of a newspaper. It should be publicly available, something that is regular. Some newspapers are published daily, some are published weekly. There should be a variety of items in each issue ranging from perhaps sports scores to movie reviews to politics. And there should be consistency. By that, we mean a newspaper must have a consistent and recognizable title and format. And here we have a definition of a newspaper right here on the screen for you to see. And when you look at these definitions, most historians pick the date 1609 in Germany, 1609 and Germany as when the first newspapers appeared. And then we started to get newspapers in English after that. Now, the first newspaper now it wasn't actually the United States, it was the American colonies at this point. Public occurrences, both foreign and domestic. I love that title, both foreign and domestic. Published one issue in 1690. The last page was a 4-page publication. The last page was blank. Why was the last page blank? Well, today we would use the term user generated content. They did not have that term at the time, but that's essentially what it was. Transportation was so difficult and so slow in 1690, it could take weeks for a publication to travel from Boston down to one of the southern colonies. It could take weeks or months for something to travel all the way across the Atlantic. So the idea was that if you were, say, a ship captain or a postmaster and you had the publication, before you passed it on to the next reader, you would fill in a few lines about what was happening in your area. So yes, it was for user-generated content, although that term was not used at the time. Now, this was published without permission. At the time, you needed permission from the British authorities who were running the colonies to publish anything. And there were some allegations that were made, especially about the French king, even alleging that he was sleeping with his daughter-in-law. And at the time, the British didn't really want to rile up the French. They might need them for allies. I mean, Britain and France have fought many times, but, you know, at the time, they didn't want to sort of like rile up their potential allies. So for that reason and some other things that were published, the newspaper was shut down after one issue. Now, Lippmann is a scholar who identified a couple of different phases, and Mindich has picked those up when we're looking at the history of newspapers. The first phase here is called government monopoly, 1609 to 1735. Prior restraint was very common. Prior restraint is when the government prevents you from publishing something. We have the First Amendment, as we have already discussed, and we are not fans of prior restraint in the United States. There is also a term called seditious libel. This means if the government doesn't want you to print something, they could stop you from printing it, even if it's truthful. Okay. Even if something was truthful, you could be prevented and get in trouble for printing it. So the end, according to Lippmann's characterization, the end of this government monopoly era was in 1735 with the trial of Zinger. What's his first name? I should look that up. John Peter Zinger. Yeah, I had to look that up. John Peter Zinger. Got in trouble for publishing some things about the government authorities, and his attorney successfully argued that truth should be a defense, that you should be able to use the veracity of an item to exonerate yourself from charges of seditious libel. So with the Zinger trial, we're using that as the end point for the government monopoly era. Then we get an era where papers are openly partisan. Um, and this lasted for about 100 years. Print was incredibly influential during the Revolutionary War. Every historian who's looked at that has come to that conclusion. Here's an example of one of the newspapers from the colonial era, the Massachusetts Spy. Here we have the political cartoon. If you look closely at the masthead, you could see this cartoon, a snake that's in different segments. Those different segments refer not to states, but they refer to different colonies with the phrase join or die. This is clearly on the side of the revolution. This is a partisan paper that is promoting the cause of revolution. And there were newspapers that were loyalist newspapers that promoted the cause of staying with Britain. The argument could be that, maybe we need some reforms, maybe we need to change the way the colonies are ruled, but by no means do we need something as extreme as a revolution. That's taking it too far. And we talk about objectivity. I'm going to talk about objectivity here in a minute. And that's something we preach and try and teach students in the School of Journalism and Media Studies. But think about the status of objectivity during something like the American Revolution. If you're a newspaper, how would you publish? If you were a newspaper publisher during this time, how would you cover something like that? Do you cover both sides and say, well, on the one hand, maybe England's not so bad, maybe the king's okay, but then on the other hand, maybe we need a revolution? Newspapers did not walk the middle line and play neutrality. They quite clearly and were oftentimes forced to take sides during the conflict. So I know that we, again, talk about objectivity, but it's interesting during a time of something, a great military conflict like this, how does a newspaper remain objective when the status of whether or not you should even be a country is under violent conflict? Interesting question. Here we have a famous front page from Pennsylvania Journal, 1765. This was published in relation to the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act. Pretty sure that's talked about in the textbook. Yes, I verified on page 83, we get a discussion of the Stamp Act. The Pennsylvania Journal, this was a fee that every publisher had to pay in order to publish anything in the colonies, and publisher of the Pennsylvania Journal refused to pay the stamp tax altogether and sort of ended the newspaper and published this final issue with the newspaper having a tombstone on the cover. Very famous. For media historians like myself, this is a pretty famous front page. Now we get the commercial era. This is associated with newspapers expanding their readership. They are moving beyond something that only the elite or merchants or bankers would read, but that the quote unquote average person would read. And we even get the creation of the penny press, newspapers that could now be purchased for a single penny or maybe a couple of pennies. As part of the expanded readership, when you're moving away from being supported by a political party, now you need money, right? If before newspapers were funded by the Democratic or the Federalist or the Whig Party, whatever the political parties were called in the 1700s, when you're moving away from that form of funding, well, you need money. You could sell advertising. To sell advertising, you need more readership. To get more readership, you need to bring your costs down. So that was one of the reasons that the costs were coming down, was to get more readership and to sell more advertising. The New York Herald was not the first of the penny press, but it was probably the first super successful newspaper. And here are the characteristics of the New York Herald. And some of these items might seem incongruous, right? They may seem like they don't go together. But I took this from the textbook. It's political independence. The New York Herald was not associated with any political party. Fearless attacks on everyone, sort of played that vociferous watchdog role. but also sensationalism, including an interest in crime news, things that sort of grab headlines, grab attention, seem very lurid. And we also have investigative reporting, sending reporters out to actually uncover stories rather than just accepting statements or pre-written speeches from a politician who might give it to them. They actually went out and tried to verify the information. So these came to be associated with the New York Herald, and some of those characteristics remain today with newspapers. Now, this is not in the textbook, but I put this in just because I think it's a great little historical anecdote. The moon hoax. This was a series of stories published in 1838 in a paper called the New York Sun. This person said they had this fancy telescope and they could see these winged creatures flying around on the moon. Okay, that they could see the moon and see these creatures on the moon. And it was actually a series of stories. And then other people started to question the moon hoax, or wasn't the moon hoax at the time. They just started to question the moon stories, like, hey, there are other people who have pretty powerful telescopes. How is it that no one else can see anything even remotely like this? And the New York Sun never apologized or never admitted that it was fake. It's just something they made up to boost circulation. They never admitted that. They just said, oh, there was a fire. The telescope was burned. We can't see the creatures anymore. Um, I think that's just an interesting story, and also shows you that false information and misinformation is not a new thing. It didn't get invented with social media, but it has a very, very long history. This is one example. Now, with the commercial era, I mentioned objectivity, and I wanted to come back to that. If you want to increase circulation and be read by as many people as possible, you could adopt this sort of objective, neutral tone. Um, if you remove bias from your news reporting, you're not going to offend any person who has strong political feelings one way or the other. You're also not going to offend advertisers. So I think it's pretty interesting that this sort of element, which has now become a central tenet of American journalism, objectivity, has commercial origins. It was adopted and spread as a way to sell more newspapers. Getting at the truth was sort of a secondary byproduct. You want to sell more newspapers, right? That's what you want to do. So don't offend people by taking a strong stance on an issue. Associated with the growth of objectivity, we get the inverted pyramid writing style. Some of y'all, if you've taken any journalism classes already, maybe in high school, you've maybe been exposed to this. The idea here is that, and this is still the writing style that's taught in classes today, you do not present a story in chronological manner. You don't begin by saying, a man came home, put his kids to bed. Then he smelled something a little odd coming from the toaster. Oh, lo and behold, it was a fire. And there was already fire in the garage. And then they called the police department. And then they got the family out. Like, you don't tell a news story in chronological fashion. You begin with the most important elements, fire at a home, 2 dead, 3 children saved. And then you present the rest of the information, with items of less importance coming towards the end. You put the most important information first, you put the less important information at the end. And one of the reasons this is done is that it makes skimming a newspaper very easy. If you don't want to read the whole story, you don't have to. You can just read the first few lines. But there's also a very practical, industrial reason why the inverted pyramid writing style has been popular for so long. If, for example, decades ago, an editor said, hey, Arsenault, I need 10 inches on that fire in La Mesa, I go out, I write a story that will take up 10 column inches, literally 10 inches in the newspaper. And then there's an ad for Macy's department store. Well, we thought the Macy's department store ad was this big. It's actually this big. You could just cut off the bottom 2 paragraphs from my story. So it's not a 10-inch story. Maybe it's a 7-inch story or a 6-inch story, and it's still going to work. It's still going to get the important information about. So again, there's commercial components as to why the inverted pyramid writing style has worked so well in journalism for so long. Beginning on page 89 is a rather lengthy discussion of yellow journalism, including two publishers, Pulitzer and Hearst, two publishers closely associated with this era of journalism. And today we use the term yellow journalism for journalism that highlights the most sensational aspect of things. Um, Here are some lecture notes. I would strongly recommend and advise you to read this portion of the textbook, or at least heavily skim it. You should be familiar with Nellie Bly and who she was and what she was trying to uncover. Um, and you should also be familiar with the Yellow Kid. That's the cartoon image you see on the right side of your screen. There was a cartoon character called the Yellow Kid that appeared in these newspapers. The term yellow journalism comes from a comic strip character. And some people say that the Yellow Kid was also the inspiration for Alfred E. Newman from Mad Magazine. If any of you know Mad Magazine, Alfred E. Newman. William Randolph Hearst was one of the publishers associated with yellow journalism, and this was one of his papers, the New York Journal. Historians and everyone agrees on this, that he really encouraged the U.S. to go to war with Spain, Spanish-American War, as a way to sell newspapers, right? Um, People buy and consume a lot of news during a time of military conflict. So this guy is like actively encouraging a global conflict so he can sell newspapers. How unethical and sleazy is that? How unethical and sleazy is that? Here we have this famous headline about the Maine. It was blown up in a harbor in Cuba. The Spanish must have done it. Well, now we know that it was an accident. It was clearly an accident. But this incident was used as one of the sort of triggers that caused the Spanish American War. And there is an incident mentioned in the textbook, mentioned on page 94. I'm a little surprised by my friend David Mindich why he included this anecdote. I mean, it's a famous anecdote. I guess maybe he can't not include it, but I think he should have characterized it more accurately. The anecdote is that Hearst sends a photographer down to Cuba to get photographs of the war. The photographer goes, there is no war, sends a telegram saying, hey, I'm here, there's no war. And Hearst famously responds with a telegram of his own saying, you furnish the pictures, I will furnish the war. This story is not true. Okay, I sat through a rather lengthy conference presentation at an academic conference where someone thoroughly debunked the story. No, it's not true. Mindich knows it's not true. What word does he use? Reportedly. What does he say? Hearst reportedly said, no, he didn't say it, but it captures the essence of what I was just talking about, that Hearst, we know, did encourage the war and tried to like stoke the fires of war. So you want that anecdote to be true, but no, that anecdote ain't true. All right, here I just put together a couple of images that I thought would be interesting. Famous headlines, famous newspaper front pages. This one, if you haven't seen this image, you should. Dewey defeats Truman. Truman was elected president, but you had to put newspapers to bed the day before they come out. Like at a certain time, you had to actually print these things so that they could be distributed on the newsstand the next day. And Chicago Daily Tribune thought Dewey was going to win and comes out with this headline: Dewey defeats Truman. Truman was elected president, and famous photograph. Now, this one is not quite so funny. It's a little more serious from 2020. New York Times, May 24th, 2020, publishes the names of people who died from COVID. Didn't put any other stories, no photographs. This is just like a stark way to make a statement about how serious COVID was. I think you all remember that, or you should remember that. Now I have some front pages from the New York Post. The New York Post is a very famous tabloid newspaper. Tabloid, like yellow journalism, is kind of a pejorative term to describe low quality, sleazy journalism. But tabloid literally comes from the format of the newspaper itself. It's bound like a magazine or a book, where it's folded along one side, and you could open it up like a magazine or a book. Tabloid newspapers have been and were very, very common in urban environments where it's very crowded and they're easier to read on public transportation. Think about that. It's easier to read a tabloid newspaper on a crowded subway or a bus than a sort of full-size newspaper that you have to fold open, if you know what I'm talking about. The New York Post is still around. I lived in Brooklyn for several years in the 1990s, actually, and we loved, the New York Post headlines. This is one of the more famous: headless body in topless bar. And to the New York Post credit, they came up with this headline, and then they actually sent a reporter to the bar to verify that it was in fact a topless bar. God forbid you make a mistake in the headline: headless body and topless bar. And then the New York Post didn't, I mean, sorry if there's anyone out there that's a Michael Jackson fan. They didn't really like what Michael Jackson. They like to call him Wacko Jacko. Wacko Jacko is Backo. Um, the New York Post tends to skew very conservative, kind of more Republican, but they kind of will take pot shots at anybody. Here's a cover, attacking Hillary Clinton. Not a positive photograph of Hillary Clinton. And then here we have, an image of Donald Trump. Hey, they weren't all Nazis, right? Some of those white nationalists chanting Jews will not replace us. Some of those are very fine people. This is what Trump said, not me. Okay. Makes for a good front page there. Here, back to COVID, back to school fashions for 2020. All right. And this is from a couple of months ago or a couple of weeks ago. Oh, yeah, this is pretty recent. As of right now, 2024, mayor of New York saying this is fine. A lot of dissatisfaction, a lot of undocumented immigrants in New York. Inflation is pretty strong. So, this is kind of illustrates sort of maybe the low brow, simplistic kind of messages that tabloids put on their covers. And here we have a famous tabloid cover from the Daily News, where a photographer snuck a camera into a prison to see a woman getting executed. Wasn't allowed to take a photograph, but he had I think the camera was strapped near his ankle, was able to get a photograph. Very, very famous cover of a woman in the electric chair. Now we have Lippmann's final stage of the press, the decline of print, 2009 until today. I will continue talking about the decline of print and the transition to digital. Newspapers as a particular form of media are not going away. Newspapers as a particular form of media, I repeat, are not going away, but the distribution form is clearly changing towards digital formats, and we're seeing fewer and fewer actual print publications. But the industry itself is not going to go away. The end. That's it. Okay. And hopefully background noise from people doing yard work and gardeners and things like that was not too distracting.